I used to think holidays meant returning to a place called home, but that was before I realized that sometimes the place you raised your children isn't where you belong anymore. That Thanksgiving, my son Michael insisted on picking me up himself. I lived at Golden Pines Assisted Living in Sacramento now, had been for 2 years. He said my grandson, Charlie, missed me. He's been asking about you all week, Michael told me over the phone, and Jenna made your favorite pecan pie. So I packed the things I'd set aside days before: my soft burgundy cardigan, a pair of wool socks, and a small jar of my homemade cranberry jam, just one left from last summer's batch. As I stepped out into the crisp November air, I still held on to a flicker of warmth. Maybe this year would be different. When we arrived at their home in Santa Rosa, Jenna greeted me at the door with a polite but restrained smile. "We got the guest room ready," she said, her eyes already glancing back toward the kitchen. "Just for 2 nights." I nodded. I didn't ask why the visit was so brief. I already knew better. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon-scented candles and polished wood floors. Charlie came bounding around the corner, arms wide, yelling, "Grandma!" He hugged me tight, and for a moment, that hug felt like everything I had hoped it would. Dinner was picture perfect: roast turkey, sweet potato casserole, and 3 types of pie arranged like a food magazine spread. I helped Charlie cut his turkey, laughing at his jokes and marveling at how quickly he was growing up. Michael talked about a new infrastructure project his firm had won, and Jenna chimed in occasionally, correcting his phrasing as she always did. But then, just as I reached for a second helping of green beans, Charlie looked up from his plate and asked casually, "Grandma, when do you have to leave?" "Tomorrow," Jenna answered before I could speak. Her tone was smooth, rehearsed, like she was confirming a flight reservation. I paused, my fork halfway to my mouth. Michael cleared his throat but didn't look up. "Traffic will be lighter if we leave after lunch," he muttered. It was like no one even noticed the sting of the moment. After dinner, I did what I'd always done. I stood and began clearing the plates. No one offered to help. The kitchen cabinets were higher than I remembered, and I had to stretch on my toes to reach the top shelf. The moonlight streamed through the window, making the faucet shine like polished silver. My hands moved on their own, scrubbing, rinsing, stacking, while the voices from the living room drifted in. "I reorganized the pantry while she was here," Jenna said matter-of-factly. "It's easier now." Michael grunted. Neither of them realized I could hear them. Or maybe they didn't care. When Jenna stepped into the kitchen, she handed me a Tupperware container. "You can take this back with you. It's low sodium." I looked down at the neatly labeled box. Low sodium, adjusted, mild, safe, like me. Later that night, I lay awake on stiff sheets, watching the ceiling fan spin. I remembered when Michael was little, how I used to stay up during his fevers, holding cool cloths to his forehead. I remembered his high school graduation, how he hugged me and said, "One day I'll take care of you the way you always took care of me." But this didn't feel like being cared for. It felt like being scheduled. And I couldn't help but wonder, as I stared into the shadows of a house that once felt like mine, how many times do we give our hearts freely, only to discover that what we saw as love, others saw as convenience? That night, I barely slept. The sheets were too stiff, and the mattress pressed hard against my back like it was trying to remind me I wasn't home. At around 2 a.m., I crept downstairs for a glass of water. The house was silent except for the steady tick of the thermostat and the low hum of the refrigerator. As I reached the bottom step, I heard voices, low and muffled, coming from behind Michael and Jenna's bedroom door. "Are you really taking her back tomorrow?" Jenna's voice was sharp, like someone pinching off the end of a sentence. "Yeah," Michael answered, sounding tired. "I don't think she wants to stay long anyway." "Well, next time check with me first. Thanksgiving's already stressful enough." I stood frozen by the hallway arch, the cold glass trembling in my hand. I didn't need to hear more. I wasn't really invited. I was inserted, like a forgotten calendar event someone remembered at the last minute. I sipped the water slowly, the chill traveling down into my chest like a bruise forming from the inside out. And then, in the quiet hum of that house, It hit me. No one had asked if I even wanted to come. I was there for appearance's sake, to keep up the illusion that this family was still intact. The next morning, before the sun had even risen fully, I was dressed, packed, and sitting by the front door with my bag in my lap. Michael shuffled in wearing his robe, coffee steaming in his hand, surprised to find me ready so early. "You're up already?" he asked. "I figured we'd beat the traffic," I replied with a soft smile. He nodded, still half asleep, and we didn't say much on the drive back. The sky outside was a dull gray, the kind that makes everything blur into the distance. The streets were mostly empty, the kind of quiet that doesn't comfort, it just lingers. When we pulled into Golden Pines Assisted Living, the automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss. Doris at the front desk looked up with her usual empty warmth. "Mrs. Carter, welcome back," she said, like I'd just returned from a pleasant cruise. I nodded and smiled, the kind of smile people give when they're too tired to explain anything. Michael didn't come in. He mumbled, "I'll call you later," and got back in the car. I didn't watch him drive away. I already knew how that story ended. I walked slowly back to my room. The Halloween sticker Charlie had stuck on the door was still there, a smiling pumpkin wearing a tiny hat. The room was exactly as I'd left it, untouched. The beige curtains, the neutral bedding, the old alarm clock that had long since stopped ticking. I'd meant to replace the battery weeks ago, but couldn't bring myself to bother. I unpacked methodically, my cardigan on the hook, the small jar of cranberry jam into the bottom drawer, and Charlie's painted turkey folded gently beneath it. And then I just sat. The room felt colder than it should have. Not from the temperature, but from the weight of being alone in a space made for waiting. That afternoon, I went to book club in the activity room. We were halfway through The Kite Runner, but no one seemed particularly interested. We took turns reading paragraphs aloud. When it came to me, I read 2 pages in a steady, practiced voice. No one commented, we just kept going. Later, at lunch, I picked at my plate. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. The placard on the tray read, "Low sodium." It didn't just describe the food, it felt like it described me. Low sodium, bland, adjusted, safe to handle. Every afternoon at 3:30 they screened old movies. That day it was The Wizard of Oz. I sat in the back, not really watching, until Dorothy looked into the camera and whispered, "There's no place like home." My chest tightened, and I had to look away. Where was home, really? This wasn't it, and neither was Michael's house. I'd raised a child in that house once, washed the windows, made Sunday pot roasts, stitched buttons back onto coats, but when I returned, I was a stranger on borrowed sheets, a guest with an expiration date, and here I was, a well-behaved file. My name was printed on a chart, my preferences logged into a care plan. Every kindness, every glass of water, every change of linens came with polite distance and mild efficiency. They cared, but they didn't see me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Instead, I reached for the small sewing kit I kept tucked inside my dresser. I hadn't used it in months, maybe longer. My fingers were slower than they used to be, but they remembered. I found a few leftover scraps of fabric and began stitching. Nothing in particular, just a pouch, a square of cloth, a shape I could still make with my own hands. Each stitch felt like a tiny reclaiming. The thread pulled tight. The corners folded just right. I worked in silence while the moonlight crept across the window. For the first time in a long while, I felt present in my own life. Earlier that day, I had overheard a nurse talking about Jeanette from room 112. "She passed in her sleep," she'd said. "Room's ready for reassignment." That was it. No memorial. No mention of the stories Jeanette had shared during knitting circle. No one paused to say, "Remember when she wore those bright yellow scarves?" Just another resident, moved out and replaced. I stared at the finished pouch in my lap, the stitches a little crooked but tight. I traced the seams with my finger and thought, if I don't do something soon, anything, I'll end up like Jeanette, not just gone, forgotten before the sheets even cool. And that's when I knew I couldn't stay still. Not anymore. The morning air was still when Margaret stepped out of Jenna's house. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't wait for breakfast. With her small canvas bag slung over her shoulder and a folded blanket in her arms, she closed the door behind her and walked away. No one followed. The sky was gray, smeared with early winter clouds, and the street was hushed, like even the birds had chosen not to witness her departure. Her back ached, her legs wobbled, but her steps were certain. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay where she was no longer wanted. At the bus station, the attendant barely glanced up. "Where to?" he asked. Margaret stared at the map above the ticket window. Dozens of town names stared back at her, none of them meaning home. She chose one at random, Roseville, simply because it sounded soft. A few hours later, Margaret was checking into a modest roadside motel on the outskirts of Roseville. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the sheets had faded flower patterns and coffee stains that no detergent could scrub out. But there was a window that faced the sky, a door that locked, a place that for the moment was hers. That night, she slept deeply. Not because the bed was comfortable, but because no one told her she could only stay 2 nights. No one whispered about her in the dark. No one offered her low-sodium leftovers with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. The next morning, Margaret walked into the small town center. It was quiet, just a diner, a pharmacy, and a few thrift shops. At a corner store, she bought scraps of fabric, thread, and a handful of zippers. With trembling hands and stubborn fingers, she began to sew again, seated on a worn bench across from the park. That first pouch was lopsided. Her eyesight wasn't what it used to be, and her fingers didn't always obey. But she kept going, one stitch, then another. As the hours passed, the rhythm soothed her, like a song only her hands remembered. Around noon, a woman in a rust-orange coat approached. She was in her 40s, hair clipped neatly back, coffee in hand. "You made that?" she asked, nodding toward the pouch. Margaret blinked. "Yes," she said, her voice soft. "I did." The woman sat beside her. "You know, I've got a friend who buys handmade goods for shops, gift boutiques and the like. He'd love this kind of thing. Mind if I take a sample? I'll pass it along." Margaret hesitated. The woman pulled out a sleek business card. "Just send 2 or 3. Here's the address. I'll make sure he sees them." She spoke with the ease of someone used to being trusted. Margaret nodded slowly. For the first time in weeks, something inside her stirred. Hope, perhaps, or just the fragile echo of being seen. That night, back in her motel room, Margaret carefully stitched 2 new pouches, one red, one navy. She embroidered them with small flowers and neat corners. She wrapped them in bubble wrap, placed them in a box, and mailed them the next morning with money from her emergency envelope. 3 days passed, then 4. On the 5th, she returned to the post office to check if the package had arrived. The clerk frowned at the address. "This building's been vacant for months," he said. "No one signs for anything there." Margaret stood silent, her knees buckled slightly. She thanked the clerk and walked back to her motel like a ghost. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the wasted work. It was the realization that she had been so ready to believe, so ready to hope that someone saw her value. And she had been tricked. Again. Back in her room, she sat on the edge of the bed, the sewing kit spilling open beside her, zippers and thread unraveling onto the floor. She picked up the phone and dialed David. He answered after 2 rings. "Mom? Where are you?" "The home said you never came back." Her voice shook. "I didn't want to go back. I just wanted to try living on my own, but I made a mistake. I got scammed." He sighed heavily. "Call the home, Mom. I'm not in town right now." Click. The dial tone buzzed like static in her ear. She set the phone down slowly and looked out the window. The wind pushed softly against the glass, like it too had given up trying to speak. No retirement cushion, no place to return to. No one asking her how she was, only where she was. She wasn't a person in anyone's eyes anymore, just a placeholder who'd wandered off script. That evening, she went back to the park bench. It was colder than before. She brought the last of her fabric scraps and stitched without thinking. The thread trembled with her fingers. Her scarf was thin. her coat older than she cared to admit. She wasn't sure if she was waiting for someone or if she simply didn't know what else to do. Then, someone sat down across from her. A woman, maybe in her late 60s, with silver hair that blew wild in the wind and a leather jacket worn thin at the elbows. She set a paper cup of coffee on the bench's armrest. "Nice stitches," the woman said, her voice raspy with warmth. Margaret said nothing. The woman didn't press. After a few quiet minutes, she stood, dropped a bundle of fabric onto the bench and said, "You coming back tomorrow?" Margaret blinked, then slowly nodded. The woman smiled. "Good. Let's see who stitches faster." As she walked away, Margaret didn't feel saved, but she didn't feel invisible either. The next morning, Margaret returned to the bench as promised. The sun was out, though the wind was sharper than the day before. She had tucked her leftover fabric scraps into a drawstring bag and brought her old pincushion, thread, and needle. Part of her expected the silver-haired woman to be just a fluke of kindness, a passing moment. But she came. Same leather jacket, a navy scarf this time, and 2 steaming cups of coffee. She set one beside Margaret without a word and opened her own sewing kit. Organized, weathered, loved. "I'm Joan," she finally said, tossing a square of fabric across the bench. "You Maggie?" Margaret nodded, smiling faintly. Joan gave a satisfied grunt. "Let's stitch." They worked in silence for a while. It wasn't the kind of silence that asked questions or filled space. It was the easy rhythm of 2 women who had known too many words in their lifetime already. They stitched not to pass the time, but to reclaim it. "You know what's worse than being old and invisible?" Joan said, eyes fixed on her thread. "Being treated like you're already finished." The word struck Margaret like a pin to the chest. Joan wasn't asking for pity. She was speaking a truth both of them had lived. Joan went on, voice brighter but carrying weight. "Got divorced at 62, moved out of the house I lived in for 30 years. My ex told me, 'Joan, what are you doing? You're too old to start over.'" Margaret looked up, brows raised. Joan grinned, sharp and fierce. "So I moved into my sister's attic. Took every odd job that didn't require a uniform. Learned to quilt. Started volunteering at the community center. Now I teach sewing, unclog sinks, and hold the spare keys. And I get to pick the playlist." Margaret laughed for the first time in weeks, a real laugh that reached her eyes. "I may not be anyone's sweetheart anymore," Joan said, "but people are glad I'm around. That's enough." Something shifted inside Margaret. Not everything, not yet, but something. Joan glanced at her stitches and whistled. "Factory work?" "I used to work in textiles," Margaret replied, almost surprised by her own voice. "Figures," Joan said. "That seam is tight enough to hold back a flood." Later that afternoon, Joan reached into her bag and pulled out a folded flyer. At the top, in bold, cheery font, it read, "Silver Hands Club, because we're not done yet." "It's at the center every Tuesday," Joan said. "Just a bunch of us, chattering away and making stuff. You'd fit right in." Margaret hesitated. "I'm not great with people." Joan shrugged. "Good. Neither are we. Come for the stitching. Stay for the coffee." She winked and walked off, waving the flyer behind her. Margaret stared at the paper long after Joan disappeared down the block. Her fingers lingered on the crease where the ink had warmed under her touch. Something about that tagline, "We're not done yet," stayed with her. The next Tuesday, Margaret went. The community center sat near a line of small antique shops, its brick exterior faded but proud. Inside, it buzzed with warmth, not loud but alive. Smells of fabric, peppermint tea, and a faint hint of lavender oil drifted through the air. 8 or 9 women sat around a long table, each working on their own piece, patches, pouches, Christmas crafts, all in progress. Joan introduced her with a grin. "Ladies, this is Maggie. Don't let the quiet fool you. Her stitches could hold up a bridge." A few heads turned, some nodded. One older woman in a green cardigan smiled and patted the seat next to her. Margaret sat down. At first, she stitched quietly, wary of interrupting. But it didn't take long before the rhythm returned. muscle memory guiding her hands. She finished 2 pouches by the end of the session, both tight and clean. "That's factory quality," said the woman beside her, clicking her tongue in admiration. Joan walked by and raised a brow. "You still think no one wants these?" Margaret looked down at her work. For years, she had stitched in silence for people who expected it, for a household that never said thank you. But here, it was seen, appreciated, valued. Before she could respond, Joan leaned in and whispered, "You're not rejecting the world, Maggie. You're just used to rejecting yourself." Margaret said nothing, but her eyes glistened. Joan gently placed the pouches in a bag. "I'll hold on to these. If you ever decide you're ready to let people see them, you know where to find me." On the walk back to the motel, Margaret held the club flyer in her pocket like a key. She hadn't felt this alive in years, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because someone had made room for her, not as a mother, not as a guest, but as a person. She didn't sleep much that night, not from sadness, but from possibility. The third time Margaret returned to the community center, Joan wasn't alone. She entered like a breeze, confident, curious, wearing a denim jacket lined with enamel pins and a baseball cap pushed slightly off-center. A camera hung around her neck, and her presence was too vibrant to be ignored. "This is my granddaughter, Eliza," Joan announced proudly. "She studies design or digital something. I just know she's always pointing that lens at something." Margaret blinked. "You brought her here to document our silver hands, of course." Eliza grinned. "Grandma says you're the stitching queen around here." Margaret chuckled softly. "That's a stretch." "Maybe," Eliza said, lifting the camera. "But from what I see, you've got magic in your hands." She began snapping candid shots of hands, fabric, pouches in progress. When the lens turned toward Margaret, she instinctively waved it away. "Don't take my picture, I'm not camera material." Eliza lowered the lens. "Every line on your face is a story someone needs to hear." Margaret looked down, quiet. Later, Eliza approached again. "Do you sell these?" Margaret shook her head. "I just make them, mostly for gifts." "What if someone wants to buy them?" "No one pays for things made by old hands," she said plainly. Eliza sat beside her, serious now. "Then let's change that." Margaret looked at her, confused. "I've been looking for a senior-led project for my portfolio," Eliza said. "Something real, something with heart. What if we launched a little online shop? I'll handle everything digital. You just stitch." Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "I've been scammed before. Some woman said she had a buyer. Turned out the address was fake." "I get it," Eliza said gently. "You don't owe me your trust. But you do deserve to be seen." That night, Margaret stayed up sewing 3 new pouches, each one neater than the last. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way Eliza said, "You've got magic." Maybe it was the memory of Joan's words, "You're not finished." Within a week, they had 10 pieces. Eliza brought lighting equipment, set up on the center's folding table, and filmed Margaret's hands threading needles, sewing tight corners, folding pouches into perfect shapes. No dialogue, just soft music and subtitles. Handmade with care, not by clock. "This is Granny's hands." The name made Margaret laugh. Who would buy something called that? "Everyone," Eliza grinned. 3 days later, Eliza sent a link to the store. Under each listing was a note. Each item includes a handwritten card from Margaret, our silver stitcher. Margaret had insisted. People need something to hold on to, not just fabric, but a voice. So she wrote, "Today the sky was cold but beautiful. I had tea with Joan, laughed once, and stitched through a cramp. Felt good anyway. Used the last piece of yellow thread Jeanette gave me before she passed. Still makes me smile. Didn't sleep much last night, but the pouch came out neat. That's something." Orders started slowly. 2, then 4, then 15. Eliza posted a short video to TikTok. Margaret sewing, cards laid out, music lilting in the background. It went viral overnight. "I didn't even show your face," Eliza said, excited. "But everyone's obsessed with your hands." Margaret blinked. People really want these? The comments. Eliza laughed, scrolling. Look, reminds me of my grandma. I'd buy them all. This is what love looks like stitched. Margaret felt something in her chest unlock. Not wide open, not loud, but steady. That evening, she took her time packaging the orders. She tied twine around each pouch, placed the cards carefully, and added a drop of lavender oil to the box. So, they remember something soft. Then she looked at the last card, the very first Granny's Hands order, and tucked it deep into her drawer. Not for the customer, for herself. One day, she'd frame it. As momentum grew, so did Margaret's rhythm. By day, she stitched at the center with Joan and the other women, laughing, sipping tea, sharing fabrics. By night, she worked from the motel bed, her sewing lamp clipped to the headboard, fingers flying, eyes focused. Eliza's friend designed tags, Granny's Hands, every stitch a story. Margaret added her own rule, no pouch leaves without a card. It wasn't just business, it was identity. And then one afternoon the phone rang. Margaret saw the name and paused. David. She answered slowly. Mom, he began, I heard from Ben, and I saw something, one of your videos. Silence. You're all over the place. Everyone's talking about your pouches. Margaret didn't reply. He cleared his throat. Jenna and we've hit a rough patch. Layoffs, bills. We were wondering if... And there it was, the unspoken reason. Do you still have savings? The air in the room thickened. Margaret stayed calm. What kind of help do you need? David hesitated. Maybe just a little, to cover the mortgage, keep us afloat until... Margaret interrupted gently. David, what you need isn't help. It's responsibility. Silence again. I'll think about what I can offer, she added, but I won't be your backup plan anymore. She hung up. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. She turned back to the pile of fabric on the bed, picked up her needle, threaded it slowly, and smiled. She wasn't done. Not even close. The Granny's Hands store didn't just survive, it blossomed. Margaret's pouches, each one stitched with steady hands and a handwritten note, traveled farther than she ever had. To Oregon, to Maine, even to Canada. Eliza kept track with pins on a corkboard, grinning every time a new state lit up. One morning, Eliza burst through the motel door again. You won't believe this, she said, waving her phone. A teacher in Austin wants you to do a virtual guest talk about crafting and storytelling. They say your notes feel like poetry. Margaret blinked. They want me to talk? Only if you want to, but they called you an artist, Grandma. Artist. She had never used that word for herself. She'd been a mother, a wife, a caregiver, but never this. Later that week, a letter arrived from Ben. Handwritten, sealed in an envelope with a tiny astronaut sticker. Dear Grandma, my science teacher saw my pouch and said it's better than anything from the store. I told her you made it and that your hands are magic. P.S. You're way cooler than Dad gives you credit for. Margaret held the letter close to her chest. It wasn't about the pouch. It was about being seen, finally, for who she was, not what she gave. That afternoon, Joan handed her a new flyer. Festivals asking for nominations, she said. Women over 60 making a difference. I put your name down. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Me? You started a business. You inspired others. You stitched your way out of invisibility. At the festival's end, when Margaret stood in front of the small crowd holding her plaque, her voice was quiet, but clear. I spent years thinking my story ended when I stopped being useful. But the truth is, it just hadn't started yet. Sometimes the second half of your life is the one where you finally get to be you. After the applause, as the crowd thinned and dusk settled, Margaret sat beside Eliza on a bench. They watched the sky fade from gold to soft lavender. Eliza, she said gently, thank you for seeing me before I remembered how to see myself. Eliza squeezed her hand. You never disappeared, Grandma. The world just took a while to catch up. And in that moment, Margaret realized she didn't need a title or permission or even a destination. She had her thread, her story, and her voice. And for the first time in a very long life, that was enough. Margaret's story is a powerful reminder that our worth doesn't fade with age, it only deepens. For most of her life, she played the role of caregiver, supporter, the dependable one in the background. But when she was no longer needed, she realized something painful. What she had given was never truly seen as a gift, it was expected. Through her quiet journey of rediscovery, she shows us that it's never too late to begin again. Age does not define when your story ends or begins. With every stitch she made, Margaret reclaimed a part of herself that had been buried under years of duty and silence. She didn't need permission to start over, she just needed to believe she still mattered. This story speaks especially to older adults. You are not invisible. You are not done. You carry history in your hands, wisdom in your heart, and stories still worth sharing. The most radical act of courage at any age is to live for yourself, not as someone's background character, but as the author of your own life.